you're entering business potentially for the first time, there are going to be things that you miss, and that's very normal.
It doesn't mean like you need like crores to get started, but it's like, okay, fine, like with this capital, how much can I make?
Hello and welcome to the Breaking Uneven podcast. Today we have our next in line for the series on how to set up your own business. And this is a very, very interesting one, and we're hoping we can give you some real actionable insights today. We're going to be discussing how to actually budget for your business. What we've done right now is that I was part of a very detailed budgeting process for a D2C linen brand, D2C bed linen brand. And so the way we're working around this is that we're going to be looking at the actual financial model that we put together and going line item by line item to explain how we calculated each aspect of the financial budgeting. And then Janvi is going to help us draw parallels to other industries and, just help kind of give you an idea of, okay, if this is how it was for bed linen, then what could it be for maybe food or tech, etc.
And I think like overall, we're trying to give like a holistic idea of hidden costs as well, like costs that maybe you don't know of, or you think that it's a smaller percentage, but in reality it might be larger than you would think. So things like that, like just hidden costs overall.
I think the idea here is that, so we tried looking this up on Google, right? Like a very preliminary search on Google. And most websites talk about, okay, like you have to add your fixed costs, add your variable costs, then you take your revenue, etc. So what it's giving you is a very surface level understanding of how to get to the final figure. But what are the actual items that come under each of these heads is something that would require a lot more of a Google search. And also, the idea here is that this entire modeling was done for an Indian brand. In the context of India. So we're hoping that, at the end of this episode, if there was even one cost head or revenue driver that we were able to identify that, applies to your business, we'll consider it a success for us.
Yeah, so given that on Google, it's quite like vague and things like that, we want to focus on like a D2C brand in India. Now, this is again like specific. We're looking at a specific company, but the idea is that it can be transferable to like other D2C brands. And there will be parallels here and there for like B2B ones as well, but we're focusing on D2C overall. But yeah, like if you want to give us like a little bit more detail to like what the brand that we're discussing today does.
So the business that we're looking at today is an online D2C brand for bed linen. It is positioned as a luxury product, and this business decided to kick off at a pretty decent scale. So they began with about 250 SKUs and about 50 individual products. So there is a certain amount of scale that this business wanted to start at and then grow from there. But essentially, as we go through it, what we will try to do is dial down those costs to if you're trying to start at a minimum level. And what we're trying to hope for is that if you are bootstrapping your business, we want to give you the best value for your money. So when you're deciding your cost heads, so that you have the most realistic picture before you begin.
Okay, so throughout the episode, we're going to look at the main budget, the cost of goods, and the revenue drivers, and then give a holistic overview to that. Starting with the main budget, when we look at that, the first thing we look at is cost of goods. So let's go line by line through the cost of goods.
All right. So for this D2C bed linen brand, right, one of the most important, and let's say the first thing that you would look at is fabric. Now, fabric in bed linen is purchased as rolls of fabric, and you buy as per meter. Now, the average MOQ here, the minimum order quantity, is somewhere in the region of 2,500 to 3,000 meters. So essentially, the cost of goods calculation begins with how many meters of fabric a particular product requires. So if you look at, let's say, a set of bed linen plus 4 pillow covers, that requires 4.4 meters of fabric. And this figure has been derived as for the most optimized use of that fabric. So we take 4.4 meters of fabric and the cost of that apportioned, obviously, to get to the first cost of within this cost of the bed linen plus 4 pillow covers.
Basically, for you, the linen is like your raw material, right? So for any kind of D2C brand, that would be like your prime raw material that you're looking at, and that's going to be a significant proportion of like your main costs. So for example, if it is a food D2C brand, then you would use like your raw materials would be the vegetables or like your fruits or grains or whatever you're making the item out of. Or if it is a skincare brand, then it's going to be all like your essential oils or your like fragrances,
Chemicals, whatever.
chemicals,
Yeah.
whatever you're using to make the product. But that's like going to be the first cost that you need to figure out, because then you can optimize accordingly.
Yeah. Next up, you've got many different heads under labor. So, for example, for the D2C bed linen brand, we have a pre-production, printing, and post-production cost. So, essentially, pre-production is the treatment that you need to do to the raw fabric to make it ready for digital printing. Then you've got your cost of digital printing, and then after you're done digital printing, there's this process called mercerization. So, all of these three essentially is what's required to take your product from the raw material to almost ready, right? So after you do the mercerization, then you've got pure labor costs, right? So the RFD, which is the pre-production, that is a machinery cost and labor. Printing is again machinery plus labor. Mercerization is machinery plus labor. Then you've got pure labor costs such as cutting, stitching, packaging, right? Where you literally, it's just a manual labor cost. And finally you get to the finished product, right? So now we using the fabric and all of these processes, we in our hands have a bed linen plus 4 pillow covers. So in other industries,
Yeah, so this is basically how to manufacture your product. Like that's your second cost. Like first is acquiring the raw materials, and the second part is manufacturing of the product. So again, like depending on like which industry you're working on and like working in and which product you're working on, it'll be the manufacturing accordingly. So if again we draw parallels to the food industry, then it would be something like actually making of the product. For example, if you're making like tortilla wraps, and if that's like your sell, then your raw materials will be like, if you're for example making like gluten-free ones, then it'll be like your almond flour or your oat flour, whatever you're making it out of. And then like your manufacturing will be like actually the making of that. So there might be labor costs of making the dough, and then like the machinery to like make the tortillas round and thin and the way they're supposed to be. So in the sense, like that's going to be your second cost to consider.
yep. Then finally you've got packaging, right? Packaging is something that's applicable to any business in the world.
Yeah.
So in this case, there are two sets within packaging. There's the cloth bag that the bed linen goes into, and then there's the box that it finally gets shipped in. So these have both been accounted for in the cost of goods as well. Now here, the complexity that comes into packaging is that if you've got multiple products, so for example, this business, as I mentioned, 50 individual products, what you essentially end up having is a range of sizes. And that is something that can drive up costs because your order quantity for each size reduces. Right. So if you've got, let's say, standard packaging across all your products, you're in a pretty good position.
Yeah.
But in this case, yeah, the box size is what, and the cloth bag size are what decide what cost gets apportioned to each product.
Yeah, and like packaging is going to be one of the most important things in a D2C brand, and surprisingly very expensive, or at least to me. When I initially thought of what packaging would be to what it is in reality, it's quite different. So I think that's like a mindful cost to attach to your product. And additionally, like if you're focusing on retail and you're focusing on a D2C brand, that's going to be like you need to give a good enough packaged product. So looking at that and considering that is really important. I think like test different packaging methods, like look at different things. Don't be fixated on just one. See the options that you have available and adapt accordingly so that you can do it efficiently. Because even though that's like the most important thing, at the end it's disposed of. So it's stupid to spend that much amount of money if it's not going to be recycled or reused.
So essentially, in the case of this brand, it was very heavily reliant on designers. Now we had three different types of deals, but for the sake of the episode, we're going to look at the average deal, which was 75,000 rupee flat payment and 10% royalty on the sale price. Now the sale price, for example, on this 2,000 rupee cost of good product would have been either 6,000 or 8,000. So in that case, at let's say it's 6,000 rupees, a 10% royalty had to be paid to the designer. So I'm going to add that 600 rupees to my cost of goods. And the 75,000 rupee is going to be a post revenue exercise. So that's just going to have to be amortized and taken into, let's say, fixed costs. So that's in that case, because I will never know that how many sales of this product did that 75,000 rupees service until I am done using that product or using that design. Which is why it can't really be included into cost of goods. So that's essentially what we did for designers, which was a very important and crucial part of this product.
Yeah, and is there a, like, for example, if you don't want to amortize it, then you can also just put it as a fixed cost, right?
Yeah.
Like you can just say that this was your cost of the year, and then it doesn't get adjusted for the following years.
Amortization, the only reason to do that would be if you don't want to show a heavy level of capex or expense in your first year, so that you can, like, on your books at least show a decent chunk of revenue or a higher EBITDA margin. That's the only reason to amortize it. And to be fair, in accounting practices, if you are using that design over more than a year, you should be amortizing it.
For your business, designer was a key part of the business because you were getting your design. And I think the way you structured it was different from other bed linen brands. That's why I guess like designers were the front facing people in it. So again, like if you draw parallels to other industries, like for a food product, it can be like the chef or the person that's creating, or a food scientist that's creating the product. You're gonna give them either royalties or like they're gonna be an important part of the business because they are the ones like either creating the product. Many times it can also be you. Like then this cost might not exist. Like for example, if it is a home baking brand, then like you're the baker itself, then there's like your cost of labor essentially that you would add to it, but it wouldn't be like an external cost that you're giving out. In skincare or makeup, then the people that are creating your formulas, those will be your key people or key laborers essentially. So that's one of like the hefty costs attached to a D2C business as well.
Coming to the next part, which was the payment gateway. For us, we used Razorpay. Now in India, the average gateway commission is about 2%. And essentially that for me on my sale price of 6,000 rupees was 120 rupees. So that's another thing I can add to the cost of goods because I know my sale price and I know my commission. There are people that choose to call the payment gateway a variable expense and take it into a different cost head. But in this case, it is very easy to include it into your cost of goods. And that, to be honest, is common across any industry as long as you're D2C, or if you have any commission. If you know your sale price and your commissions, then you can apportion it to cost of goods.
Yeah. I also think it's important to decide your selling price also based on all of these. I mean, technically you can't, because like the minute you increase your selling price based on gateway payments, it'll again increase. So it's...
The point here is that when I derived my pure landed cost of goods, right, it was 2,000 rupees. Now I know that, okay, if my landed cost is 2,000 rupees and I want to sell this for a 67% margin, I'm pricing it at 6,000 rupees. Then I can take my royalty and payment gateway commissions, because those are percentages, and apply them to the cost of goods. However, if you're looking at pure landed cost of goods, in that case, our exercise would have stopped at before we discussed the royalty payments, essentially.
Yeah, so I think like your price, like I guess this is not necessarily in terms of budgeting, but also like coming up with your price model, it comes like a culmination of all of this. Like you can base it on just like your cost to make the good, and then you can also divide all your other costs that come off. Because these are some of them that were still variables, like in terms of like your royalties or like the goods sold, you essentially get those costs only once the good is sold.
So essentially now what we have is the cost of goods. Now keep in mind that essentially, let's say, for example, you're looking today at an online business and you're like, hey, you know what? I can start making, I don't know, phone covers and sell them at 1,000 rupees.
Yeah.
Right? Slightly like decent level phone covers and you want to sell them at 1,000 rupees. But then when you actually do your costing exercise and you realize that, hey, this is going to cost me like 700 rupees to make a phone cover, then the margin is too small for you to like, unless you reach a ridiculous amount of scale, for you to really be able to cover all your other costs. So essentially, doing a cost of goods exercise is also very important, because what you end up deriving as your cost of goods is definitely not what, let's say, anyone else might end up at, because they might have better deals, or you might have better deals with manufacturers. You might find better processes, they might find better processes.
It's going back to like in our first episode where we said like the unique thing that you have in either manufacturing, distribution, or your network. So yeah, like if you have any sort of benefit like that, you're already advantaged to it, where it
100%.
would be
And
different.
it's also a very good exercise to validate your idea, because, for example, you might think that you can make the product better, but if your pricing does not match, like if you cannot get a margin after you derive your cost of goods, then you understand that, okay, that's why these other players in the market are not making this product that I want to make, because the cost of goods is just too high. So essentially, it's a great way to validate your business idea as well.
Okay, so then we have fixed costs overall for the business to run on a monthly basis. So these can be the monthly costs, also one-off costs, depending on like how you work with them. But in case you're hiring people, you'll have salaries overall. You might have a marketing and branding team on board for like your logos and social media posts and things like that. So if you have them, that's a team. You'll have an operations team perhaps, if again like it's a D2C brand, like so packaging and things like that. I guess like early on all of this can be a culmination of few people, but then eventually this would also be different teams. You'll also have a CA on hand, or a finance and accounts team, depending on the scale of your business. But those are overall like different teams and like salary, like potential salaries that you would have to pay. And then other expenses overall would be like technology expenses, which include like your website, like even like WhatsApp, like tiny things like that.
Shiprocket integration.
Shiprocket.
You've got any CRM software, ERP software that
yeah.
you'll be using, all of those subscriptions. There's a lot that comes
Yeah.
into it. Like, for example, if I have to just list down everything that was involved here, right? So technology would include any kind of one. So this is technology plus infrastructure, right? So let's say the laptops that you might buy for yourself and your team. You're talking about subscriptions for like Meta Business,
Yeah.
etc. You're talking about subscriptions for
Canva.
your website, for Canva. Within your website, like let's say on Wix, for example, or let's say on WordPress, you have the WordPress subscription plus all the plugins that you might end up buying. So all of these things come under technology and infrastructure expenses, and that's a really long list of small costs, but together added up, it creates a pretty decent expense. And like, it is very difficult to budget for this on day one. Like, for example, in employee cost, let's say I'm looking at an employee cost of 15 lakhs for the first year. I'm going to take a 7 to 8% variance there, that, okay, it can go up and down based on final like CTCs, etc. But in technology, you can take like easily assume a 25% variance, because if you hit like a really good amount of scale in your first year, even at scale, those costs suddenly rise up.
Yeah, because a lot of them are also based on quantity, right? Like things like that. So like as and when you scale, the cost to you will increase. And there are ones that are fixed as well. Like for example, like Shopify, it is like 1,500 rupees a month for the most basic thing. So that's going to be recurring as long as the website is alive. So yeah, it's like balancing those. And then like it's when you want to get like more creative and things like that, the plugins come in, so it all just like keeps adding up. But the next thing would be like photography and campaigns. So again, like when you're launching your product, you're gonna get a photo shoot done. You'll need like stock photos for Instagram, for your website, for any like social media presence, to make like even like physical assets like flyers or banners or anything like that. If you have an office, then you have to pay rent for the office. That's a cost unless you're working from home. But if there's rent, then there's electricity and other charges that would be associated with it. Any travel expenses, I guess, for work overall, and then professional fees as well to like any kind of advice or lawyer or
consultant, etc. Your CA. You're talking about your CA, you're talking about your GST filings, you're talking about your annual
Yeah.
returns, you're talking about any consultants you might have, someone to help you with your pitch deck. There's again a lot that comes in the professional fees, but that just depends on uh, who all you're gonna need to get involved with your business. At a minimum level, it would be a CA and someone to do your annual returns. Even if you have an accountant in house, you still need an auditor.
Yeah.
So that's something that you would need at a minimum level.
Yeah, and again, like this is like a long list of just things. There are a lot that you can do yourself. Like when you're starting early on, it
Yeah.
doesn't mean you need to have like every single person as a salaried person or as a like a paid this thing. Like for example, if you want to do a shoot for your product, iPhone quality is also pretty good. So you can, like, if you have that aesthetic in mind, you can start there. What we are trying to do is just make a list of all the costs that you could potentially have, and then this can be altered depending on your scope.
Now, I know what you're thinking. We're missing one big cost head here, and that's marketing. And that's because that requires a little more discussion.
Yeah.
Now, the thing about marketing is, for example, in this business, right, marketing was pegged at about 30% of the overall revenue that you can expect to generate. Now, the reason for doing that, of the overall EBITDA that you might generate. Now, the reason for doing that is that in D2C, you're in today's world, you're looking at really high bid costs for, let's say, a meta advertisement. If you're looking at really high costs of customer acquisition, and essentially your business can fail or succeed based on the amount of like money you put into marketing. Now, if you're, let's say, a retail brand, right, your marketing expense could be hoardings, maybe something digitally, etc.
Yeah.
But you won't put that much money into it because you know that, okay, hey, like someone walking into my store is going to have more, like casually walking in is going to have like a lot better of a customer cost of acquisition as compared to me putting something online and then expecting someone to walk in. So therefore, in D2C, your marketing expense for digital just has to be about 25-30%. There are businesses that amp it up to 35-40% of your investment to really get that kind of return.
I feel like in this day and age, like marketing does play a key role just because there's so many products. So I think in a way that kind of like helps differentiate. Like you connect with an ad and that would like pull you. Or I think there's also like a lot of value in repetition. So like so many, I see the same ads like 20 times,
Yeah.
but then it like sticks in your brain. So like you know that the next time you need something like that, like you're gonna go to that brand. So I think a lot of people also play that game, like just to be visible, just to be known. They'll push it, they'll put a lot of money in marketing hoping for that return. But yeah.
So essentially now, if we take the example that we've been looking at so far and just know that these numbers are just indicative of the scale of this business when it wanted to begin, right? Essentially, what we have identified is the total cost of goods plus the total cost of marketing, employee, etc., etc. Now, all put together, we've pretty much found out what we're going to spend in a year's time, right? Like this business assumed that that inventory is going to last one full year. And so now we know that, okay, how much is going to cost us, how much everything else is going to cost for a year. And therefore you have a 1 year runway. Ideally, you should do this exercise. For example, for D2C, you should do this exercise for 5 years. So in fact, this model does capture up to 7 years of such a model. And what that helps with is you can expect in D2C luxury, especially, that you're not going to see a profit for up to 5 to 7 years. That's just the consequence of the industry. Now, you might be in a different type of industry where you can start seeing a good amount of healthy revenue on day one. For example, F&B, if you're opening up a restaurant, you do a good launch event, etc., you can start seeing revenues from day
Yeah.
one. So at a minimum level, 2 to 3 years is the kind of runway you should be calculating. So you take all your costs, multiply it with some amount of escalation. So if for 3 years, so that gives you your 3 year runway. Of course, for cost of goods, you don't just multiply it by escalation, but also what kind of expense, like what kind of stock you expect to sell over 3 years. And therefore, you've got now your 3 year expense plan. Let's say all put together, this comes to 1 crore that you expect to spend over 3 years. That does not mean you need to raise 1 crore or put in 1 crore to start your business,
Yeah.
because this is money that you're going to be spending over the course of 3 years. And that brings us to the point of revenue. So, how do you actually start to calculate revenue? In the case of the D2C brand, a lot of the revenue assumptions, actually, all of the revenue assumptions were done entirely on it from a digital perspective. I'll pause here because I don't want to get more into the digital aspect of revenue before we discuss, like, for different businesses, what are the possible revenue streams that you can look at.
Okay, yeah. So when we're talking about revenues again for a D2C brand, I guess like your revenues, it's gonna be from your product, but like the sources of them can be like your website, can be social media, can be from like your ads, pop-up stores, if you're doing physical
Collaborations.
collaborations, physical ads, influencers, things like that. So there can be multiple sources from where, or sources of like your consumer essentially from where they are. But the reasoning to do this when you're doing your budgeting is that if you put percentages of like, or even a rough estimate of like where you're getting each revenue from and how much that could be, you get to know that what you need for your initial investment. Because like Anuj said, that over 3 years, for example, if you need 1 crore, but you know that you can make up to like 50 lakhs in the first year in just revenue, then you know that, oh, 50 lakhs a high amount, but whatever, 25 lakhs, then you know that the cost that you require early on is less than the entire cost you need overall.
Yeah, essentially, think of it this way. Let's say you're going to expect 20 lakhs of cost this year, 30 lakhs next year, and 50 lakhs in your third year, right? And let's say you can make revenues of 15 lakhs this year. That means next year you only need to infuse a further 15 lakhs of capital
Yeah.
to actually run your business. Now, I know we're speaking annually. This is not an exercise that happens annually. Your cash flows you need to be able to predict on a monthly basis.
Basic. Yeah.
And so it's very important for you to actually calculate the right budget, which to actually to calculate how much capital you need to infuse at what points of time. You need to make sure that your projected cash flows are as accurate as possible. Now, the best thing to do is obviously, what when you do a costing exercise, amp up the costs slightly. So take a variance of 5% on some, 25%, as I mentioned, for stuff like technology costs. And then when you're projecting your cash flow, amp it down by that same 5
Yeah.
to 25%, depending on the revenue source. Essentially, that'll give you enough of a buffer between your projected outflow and inflow to actually, like, to make sure that you are sticking as per plan.
Also, a lot of the costs are variable costs, which can be determined based on the revenue you get. So, for example, if it is marketing costs, you don't have to put in like 10 lakhs in the first day. Like, you start small, and then the minute you get any sort of revenue, you can recycle the revenue for that marketing cost. So, you're not taking on like liabilities early on without any like revenue coming in. So, there are multiple costs like that you can like vary depending on what your source of revenue looks like.
And essentially, that's pretty much it. Like,
Yeah.
it's not a very like long list or exhaustive list for sure, but what we're trying to do here is just to get your brain buzzing about how to do a budgeting exercise that goes slightly beyond what a Google might tell you. Main takeaway for me, for example, from this would be, if I were you, I would take away the fact that, okay, if my business is going to cost me 1 crore to set up, I don't need to put 1 crore on day one. I need to be able to predict my cash flows strong enough so that I can actually manage potentially with 50 lakhs infusion.
Yeah, and also like trying and making a list of all the hidden costs. Because for example, sometimes like when you start something new, and to justify starting something new or to validate that idea, you only kind of look at the raw material costs and the manufacturing costs, but you kind of like forget the rest. So it's important to also account for like smaller things. Like there's also like registration that you have to consider, having like the CA, like all of these are added costs that you would need to then divide amongst like the products that you're selling. So trying to make like that exhaustive list as early as possible would be as more informative for you in the longer run.
Yeah. And just remember that you always have miscellaneous costs. Like, that is
Yeah.
definitely, I would say that if your total, whatever your total budget is, account for up to 5% of that as miscellaneous costs,
Yeah.
because you're entering a new industry, you're entering business potentially for the first time. There are going to be things that you miss, and that's very normal. Don't be scared when a random new cost that you didn't expect jumps up on you. As long as you have allocation for miscellaneous, that's something that will help you like remain calm and accept that cost for what it is.
Yeah, and I feel like if you're starting with limited capital, keep that as like your budget. So for example, you're okay with spending an 100 rupees, for example. Keep that as like your over being like, okay, I can't cross 100 rupees, and then divide that 100 rupees by different parts, which we've gone through in like this episode, but overall as well, like whether it's like raw materials, whether it is um manufacturing, marketing, miscellaneous, technology, like divide your 100 rupees accordingly, so you know like at what scale you can start. It doesn't mean like you need like crores to get started, but it's like, okay, fine, like with this capital, how much can I make? Again, like when you are starting small, the disadvantage is the price you get, like the from like your vendors. Essentially, they will give you a higher rate per unit just because of the smaller MOQs that you're gonna order. But at the same time, it gives you the opportunity to enter a market, and then when you are growing, your costs are only lower because you already have like a good price point set in the market.
That's about it. And please always make sure to revisit your costs as often as you can,
Yeah.
to see if you can negotiate further, to see if something is going to go up, to see if that, okay, I've reached this level of scale. Do I have some more leverage now,
Yeah.
etc., etc. And
Try and keep it as like low as possible. Ask friends and family for help when you're starting out. Do as much as you can on your own. Like if unless you don't have the expertise in it, then definitely outsource it. But try and do as much as possible on your own. So then again, you're not burdened with costs, or you're not stressed to get those revenues early on.
cool. Hopefully, you've been able to, take away something from this
Yeah.
episode. And yeah, we'll catch you in the next one.
Yeah, hope this like series is helpful overall. And if y'all have any ideas or questions, then please do let us know.